We're here for part 2 of a very interesting conversation with Odessa, who has some thoughtful and surprising takes. Just have a few notes for you, since Odessa is incredibly well read, and we had to look up some of these things. A fruiting body of a mycelial network. Mycelium are fungi, and they have networks underground. When they produce fruit, there's a mushroom. Odessa is talking about mushrooms as a metaphor for the transgender experience, whether it's invisible or displayed. Aristotelian trichotomous soul. Aristotle believed that there were 3 parts to the soul: vegetative, sensitive, and rational. Some Christian thinkers have made connections between Aristotle's idea about what the soul was and the Apostle Paul's phrasing of body, soul, and spirit in his letters. I'm sure there's other interesting comments in the following conversation, but I'll just let you look up the rest yourself and come along for the ride. As always, shoot us a message or comment on Substack if you'd like to respond to something we specifically said. Enjoy! Hello and welcome to part 2 in a conversation with our friend Odessa the Barefoot, who we got to hear last time some of Odessa's story related to your transgender experience and life of faith. So if you haven't listened to that yet, friends, then encourage you to go back to part 1. But part 2, we are jumping into Odessa. You have a whole dissertation on gender, which I think you've described as, hundreds of pages to work through your own experience in some regards, but tying together your experience, how we think about gender in society, and how do we think about theologically. So we're really excited to, just get to benefit from the hours that you put into thinking through this and from your vantage point, and we have so many questions, and we'll see what we have time for in this conversation.
Yeah, sure thing. And I appreciate the opportunity to, this was all done personally and with a handful of, trans friends. And so figuring out where it fits into the bigger conversation, this is the first step for me in that process. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. We're happy to have you on. So maybe let me begin. In our own conversations and also in our recording last time, you occasionally use this phrase called the project of pursuing womanhood, or something similar, in that similar vein. Could you tell us and our listeners more, what do you mean by that phrase? And what does this project entail when you say that?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. It prompted a lot of reflection, because there's certainly a sort of becoming or pursuing dimension that's been added on recently. That's kind of a newer piece. There's a deeper kind of ontological thing that reflects it. I think maybe the best phrase would be the project of being a woman as something that I've kind of recently accepted. Whereas there's that and that's how I would frame what's been added on more recently. So the way that, I've been thinking about this in terms of it's like the fruiting body of a mycelial network, right? So there's this whole, invisible set of factors, culturally, biologically, psychologically, for myself personally, but I think for all trans people, there's just such a complex experience. And this is sort of an inevitable manifestation of something that's really complex. And so all this sort of simplistic attempts to answer, trans questions, aim at the fruiting body. How do we prevent this from even being visible, right? And that inevitably goes into sort of violence against the erasure of that which is unusual, right, or unexpected. So as I've kind of come to think about that in terms of my own project, what is this project that's kind of emerged recently? I think the underlying piece, framing it like the Aristotelian trichotomous soul, right? So the internal kind of deep piece is a sort of orientational aspect towards my own sense of gendered experience, which has, as I've kind of described, always been oriented to the feminine in complex ways that were really shameful. And then outside of that, kind of analogous to the sensitive soul, is this kind of project. And inevitably, this identificational orientation has projects which before, very recently were to me something that I always had like privately and tried to negotiate. It was separated from kind of like my public existence. And then sort of like the outer layer of it is sort of this commitment, an existential commitment, which is how how I'm defining gender these days generally is, or has to do with this sort of like existential commitment to a certain mode of being in the world. And so what's emerged recently is recognizing that kind of leaning into public feminine presentation is extremely satisfying for me in ways that I can't quite account to, leads to a sense of like, okay, existential commitment of being a woman and contributing to that is sort of like recognizing, of course, like this is my embodiment and history is unusual for people who generally identify as women. And that's a source of tension and kind of a mystery. But that I believe that I have something unique to offer that conversation and a lot to learn. And so that's where I would say the things that have been added recently, which we might call as a pursuit, as you kind of framed it, are the sense of like trying to systematically and in an integrated way, like be socially legible as a woman, and the sense of like propriety or ownership, which I'm always very reserved at, out of the sense of reverence for women and women's experience. Like I don't want to insert myself into spaces where I don't belong, but I find more often than not, I am welcomed into those spaces because there's so much of, I think, being a woman, which is being just kind of like a second-class human, and to own that is recognized as canonic by women. And the people who are trying to defend that are actually not defending womanhood as such. They're defending a certain kind of vision of social order and a certain kind of like, like authority structure that like I'm in a sort of cosmic violation of. So that's kind of how I would frame where things are. And so that pursuit is then between the recognition of like, okay, so the desire to be socially legible and then kind of like the existential commitment to show up in places where it might be uncomfortable with all of my sort of ambivalence about how I fit within the category of womanhood, just as to continue to be a part of like that as a dialogical emergence of like, what does it mean, this way of being human? So.
Can you elaborate? You said, was it canonic experience or what you?
Yeah. Well, it is a self-emptying, right? Like a sense of all of the kind of like social privileges that come from just following what was my given, in terms of like a cis presenting, straight male, right? Into, like being trans is not exact. There's no privilege fit whatsoever. And yeah, so there's that sense of like the removal of any kind of like, privilege or advantage of kind of like that default mode of embodiment and social location.
Can we talk more about this definition of gender that you're using?
Yeah.
If I heard you correctly, you talked about this existential commitment to a mode of being in the world, which is, I think, a pretty general sort of definition. I don't know, is there any more specificity you could add to that?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, where I started, sorry, go ahead.
No.
Yeah, where I started in defining gender was actually that, gender is the chief identitarian potentiality of the soul, such that, whenever there's identity formation that happens, it implicates and activates the generative aspect of the soul. Souls themselves being ungendered, but having a capacity for gender. We don't have an identity that's kind of like predetermined, but like we take on an identity in the course of like our embodied historical being, right? As human beings. And I take that, really from Genesis being the model of that. There's this first distinction between male and female that then kind of accumulates additional distinctions of, family and language and nation and then, whatever, like sports ball team, identity formation always kind of like has a sort of gendered behind it. And the way that I would kind of take a more abstract view of gender, right? Gender etymologically has to do, first of all, with a genus. It's a category of things. I think about that grammatically. A gender, some languages have more than 2, more than 3 genders, you have 16 genders. There's nothing to do with kind of like biological sex. It's like these are categories of categories of words that have similar properties, categories particularly of nouns. And that relates to categories of, sexed beings, and in many languages, not all. And so to do first with a genre, or a category of things that have similar properties, and also with generation, which is the connection then to sort of like biological sex, is that like how does this category of things like propagate itself, right? And with respect to non-sexed objects, that propagation happens in various modes. But of course, like human propagation, like women, there is a biological component, which is, like not specific to women. All humans come into the world in the same way. But there's like a social production of womanhood as well, right? And so obviously, yeah, I mean, like that's kind of the complexity of gender underlying that. So then to say, well, what then is a woman? Well, a woman is a person who is existentially committed to the project of being a woman, that is taking ownership of kind of like this social category and place in the world, right? So people who are biologically female can opt out of it. People who are not biologically female can opt into it, right? And that existential commitment looks different for cis people than for trans people, right? But the existence of the distinction between cis people and trans people, I think, gives us greater insight into the nature of womanhood and manhood, or masculinity and femininity, as something that extends beyond biological sex and draws attention to the complexity of embodiment and the complexities of kind of like the social construction of gender. So yeah, that's the way that I would kind of unpack that at this particular moment. Yes.
Can you talk more about this position that you prefer, that souls are not gendered? And you talked about that coming from a reading of Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, would you just unpack that? Because I think that will be a question for some listeners. Like, how is that the case compared to an idea of the soul being gendered?
Yeah.
And kind of that potentiality growing, like, for example, a male soul going into being a man, etc.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so a soul, I would say a soul is not gender, like thinking about a generic abstract soul, right? Human soul is not, it has some kind of a relationship to the sexed body, right, necessarily. And the sexed body has a significant impact on the sort of like identity formation as gendered, right? But not a completely determinative one, as the existence of trans people would indicate. So that's kind of how I would look at that. Like, I think it's inevitable. It's inevitable that a soul would be gendered. But like the abstract generic soul, if we think about just kind of like, I mean, I'm thinking kind of like Thomistic Aristotelian terms about kind of the soul as the form of the body, right? And so like then when there is embodiment, there is what sexedness comes along with embodiment. Genderedness comes along with the sort of like unfolding of the soul. Here again, kind of like the trichotomous dimension of or trichotomous or developmental picture of the soul comes into play. And so gender unfolds as a process of development of a person who has a sex body, which is less variable than gender, but still extraordinarily complex and mysterious. But something I am less capable of commenting on. It's not sort of my field of reflection. But as also Aquinas would kind of just bow out of a lot of these questions. Like question biology are quite complex, and sexed biology is more complicated than we ever sort of had thought. Yeah. And there's a lot that we're learning there. It has some fixity to it. I think I have a hard time, I know that there's some people who are at a position of like, well, there are more than 2 biological sexes. Like I personally, I think that, there's a compelling case around, bodies that tend towards organization around small gametes versus large gametes. Mm-hmm. But, there does seem to be there's some environmental or developmental differences that come with how bodies then form around kind of like a default setting. So it's very complex, and
Yeah, I agree.
and like the biological component seems to have some binary aspects to it, even if there are other spectrumy aspects to it, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of influences that seem to maybe nudge where the binary switch would be flipped one way or the other, right? So
In
yeah.
May I? So I think you and I are on the same page. It's often I think the bi relates to maybe the gendered soul in a propensity manner, right? Like it produces certain propensities towards developing in this way or that way.
Yeah.
And I also think the compelling case is the large gamete, small gamete sort of case. I think that is compelling in how we think about the human person and the human embodiment.
When you guys are saying small and large gametes, is that a different way of saying
Like eggs
male,
and
female,
sperm. Yeah.
binary?
Yeah, eggs and sperm for reproduction. But
Thank you.
I'm trying to think about this. I want to get into this topic later, and I'm curious what you think now, maybe because we touched it. But there's another question that comes up often is, okay, we see these propensities. We see some people buck these propensities, but that's maladaptive, or that is somehow moving towards it's a developmental disorder. And this even comes up with sexual orientation, right? It's like, yes, most people seem to predominantly be what we call straightly oriented.
Yeah.
There's some spectrum of people who are not minority, mostly, you might say. But that's a maladaptation, or that's bad or something. Yeah, how are you thinking about this?
Yeah.
This question that comes up. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I would say it's certainly disordered or maladaptive with respect to biological reproduction, right? Like that it takes people out of the pool, as it were, when, well, I mean, not all trans people are transition in a way that results in infertility, but many do, right? I'd say that's very frequent. But it's not disordered or maladaptive within other frameworks, right? Like, I think particularly, of eunuchs, right? That Jesus, there's a place for eunuchs in the kingdom, right? There's a place for eunuchs in the family of God.
Amen.
And so there is an order that extends beyond biology, right? And that this, again, interestingly, with respect to generation, like, that if we think of in the kingdom, neither are married nor given in marriage, but are like the angels. There's a sort of angelic mode of propagation or generation that gender non-conforming people who are thus rendered biologically infertile would participate in, which has advantages and disadvantages over biological generation. Like it opens up possibilities for one's kind of like social and ecclesiastical presence that are not possible for people who are involved in the economy of biological generation. So, I mean, there's certainly a difference. And I think that, a value system which puts like ultimate premium on biological generation, has other disadvantages besides removing or by fundamentally pathologizing trans experience and intersex experience. Because it ultimately does negatively impact cis people, right? And people who are, for reasons beyond their control, not able to participate in biological generation for any number of reasons. So I think that I find it compelling to move away from language of disorder for the sake of these other kinds of situations that remove even cis people from economy of biological generation. So
everything you just said,
I find it interesting.
Oh, sorry. You're saying directly related?
Yeah, just thinking about how much of your thinking right here is still ordered around ideas of generation and propagation. And it's just interesting to contrast that to some forms of like radical queer theory, which are, in my perspective, kind of nihilistic in that they're like, let's kill all thinking about generation and propagation so that we can just have the justice in the immediate moment because dreams of tomorrow will destroy, but you're actually thinking about, okay, what are the higher orders, and different modes of like, what is the goodness that still should be propagated going forward, and how are you participating in that? I'm curious, I guess, just to, maybe this will come as we go, but hearing more of what that, you're talking about people who like people to opt in or opt out of the project of manhood or the project of womanhood, that existential commitment. And is there a moral impetus for people to opt in or opt out? Like, should they opt into one or the other? Do they have to opt in at all? And if so, what's that larger framework for why these things are worth opting into?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I would say, first of all, existential commitment is more than volition, right? So, I see our bodies as involved in kind of like our existential commitment. Like, for a trans person to engage in bodily modification is a reflection of an existential commitment. And for a cis person to not engage in bodily modification is participation in that kind of existential commitment. And that existential commitment is really, there is a volitional component, but it's really held in it's held socially, it's held kind of like ontologically, and sort of like participated in terms of our volition. There's a recognition, like for myself, it's more of a recognition of my own sort of burning need to speak the truth about the complexity of my experience, which led me to a place where, like the fact that I was trying to compassionately give space to trans experience on the basis of having parallel internal experiences led to a kind of rejection, which then puts me in a position where then I kind of also embody the things that I'm oriented towards, right? So I see that existential commitment as something that's complexly formed and not merely arbitrarily chosen. So in terms of what are our obligations, or how do we evaluate the volitional choices we make around opting in? I think there's a tension between, recognizing what is and then also kind of orienting ourselves to what can be. And like both of those are considerations and decisions we make around our gendered embodiment. And, I think there is a sense of I think the right lens to look at this through would be one more towards vocation towards biological generation versus a vocation that, it's already there in the scriptures. Like the trans embodiment is prophetic and is sort of kingdom oriented, right? And so, like I think that there's the right lens would be a sort of like consistency or coherence of one's vocational path. And so like my own experience then is really ambiguous or ambivalent with respect to like the ethical processes. On the one hand, like the decisions that I made in terms of gendered expression were not coherent with the previous decisions that I had made regarding marriage and family life on the one hand. On the other hand, should I have made those decisions about marriage and family life my own sort of like propensities that I was aware of and didn't have language for, right? So I think the moral evaluation question is complex. Ultimately, what I rely on is, it's like, well, at the end of the day, like we're all sinners, right? And our sins are forgiven, and we do the best that we can in terms of our moral evaluation, decision making. But ultimately, our hope is not in getting it right. Our hope is in being beloved in the reality of getting it wrong, and that there is restoration and redemption when we do consistently fail. Not that that's an excuse to then not care, but that's really where the gospel meets us. So yeah, that's how I would look at it at this point. I am haunted by the question of what are the moral obligations and what is the right moral framework to make decisions. And I don't feel like there are any good answers to that.
I just want to say from an empirical place, as I've been talking with different trans people in my circles or in my life, people are deciding that different moral obligations are like their obligations are different, right? Like we have some trans friends who decided not to socially transition really at all almost. We have other trans friends in our circles who have transitioned, and they both try to provide a moral account based on their Christian life and faith. And also their understanding of what the world is like, what human beings are like, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And that's part of the tension, I think, that some people feel too. Like, how can these people who are like having similar experiences, Christians, but coming to somewhat different positions and things that we think are important.
Yeah.
And this also can be replicated in sexual orientation,
yes,
sexuality conversations too.
Absolutely.
But it's the same thing.
Yep.
So I was going to point out one thing before David Frank asked this last question on moral evaluation. I was going to point out everything you talked about, gender, experience, and expression, I think would be the same thing for us in the side B school of thought around sexuality.
I think
we could basically everything you said, we could just put sexuality and sexual orientation in there, and it's like the same thing. And like we are like the angels. What sort of vocation? We move beyond. We think that there is a biological good of children, and in our sexual ethics for side B, embodiment's pretty prominent because of our certain ethic of right sexual expression that's blessed by God. But we think there's higher orders of goods or something, that kind of there's an eschatological good that we participate in, and we're meant to participate in, which the common straight church doesn't want. They don't talk about it, or the theology is too reductionistic to engage in these higher orders of discussion. So I just want to point that out.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
I really love that these conversations, at least in some ways, we're on side B, and some of the trans conversations you're engaging.
Yeah.
We're thinking in similar logics. We have similar logics and similar dynamics.
Absolutely.
How we're processing.
And I regard myself as, side B resonates a lot in a lot of ways. And I regard myself still as just a very traditional thinker, right?
Yeah, I get it.
I'm interested in a dialogue with kind of queer theology, and it's just like, I just think about things differently. This is my formation. This is what I've received, and it's the basic tools and formulations of my thought are really deeply, fundamentally rooted in the tradition. I've just come to a place in my own development where some of the things that I used to believe were traditional, I've come to see as more reactionary and not really sufficiently attentive to emergent features of culture and people's experience of themselves. Like, again, it's we see the fruiting body of the mycelial network, and we're like, oh my God, that's wrong. It's a sign of decay. It's a sign of brokenness.
Yes.
So we kind of try to mow down the mushrooms, but it's like, it's still there in the dirt, right? Like, like you're just committing violence against the mushrooms. Like, you're not actually attentive to what is kind of like already imminent within the whole frame of the way of thinking. And I think that, like, whereas a lot of queer theology says there is no, it's like we've got to burn it all down and start over because there was no space for queer people. It's like, well, there's actually a lot of space for queer people, right, into Christian thought. It's just that, unfortunately, the moment that we're in paints this as like really like an inherent and irresolvable hostility between queer people and Christian theology and historical Christian theology. Whereas I think that that's really the invention of the last couple hundred years, and the emergence of like rigid norms around gender, sexuality, and embodiment that would not have made a lot of sense. Well, they would. I don't think they're only continuous in retrospect, right? Like, I think that there was always a particular blessing of marriage and family life historically in the church.
Yeah,
but it's not something that was normative to the point of like policing people to the point of like, you must opt into it, right? That's the pressure that I think is quite new.
Agreed.
And that's hits on. So when I was talking about like, oh, what are the kind of moral impetus of opting in? You're mentioning the various aspects of the existential commitment, of which one is the bodily part. But in thinking about those, just the various social cultural norms around gender expression, and how does that relate to me as a cis person, and in what way am I, opted into that existential commitment in just my body? But I know some versions of, culture, Christian culture, that be like, Andy, you should really be masculine in all these ways, and you're not really being faithful to your manness, your masculinity, unless you're doing all these things. So, and then, like, is my desire to pursue a vow of celibacy, does that change some of my existential commitments around gender, because I am going away from the route of biological propagation? And
right. Yeah. And I as I think about my own journey and kind of like my own, manifestation of transness, right? Like there is something there that's like perennial, like that would have been something that I wrestled with regardless of kind of like whatever, cultural or historical context I found myself in. But like particular to our moment are both the affirming voices of like, this is what this means. This is transness. This is kind of like your relationship to gender, but also the anti voices. Like those two things together form the emergence of my own sort of like trans embodiment. Right. And I think that there's an unfortunate dialect, or the one of the unfortunate results of this, like my friends who are kind of like anti-trans, or I guess, I don't know, I don't spend a lot of time with them. I still regard them friends. Even we don't spend a lot of time together. I hope for reconciliation there. They don't recognize their participation in the emergence of my trans identity, right? Like that my rejection by them was part of how I became trans, right? Or became visibly trans. The rejection that I experienced. And like for them, it's just like my brain was taken over by some kind of like woke mind virus, and like, we no longer have anything in common, right? And yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly what to do about that, because like it's just not an accurate perception of what happened, and like, but it's not one that I can confront because we no longer have a relationship, right? Like you could send them this podcast like when it's done or something, and they may or may not listen to it, right? So yeah, it's I think that having a sense of like how the whole, and how like we're all members of one another, like we can't get away from that, right? Like just to be more compassionately present to the reality of things that emerge and the wholeness of things as they are, rather than like trying to make sure that things only happen in the way that we've kind of like determined they ought to, right?
I wanted to touch on something that's a bit autobiographical in my case. So I mentioned this in other times of the podcast. When I was young, I was very gender non-conforming.
Mm-hmm.
I thought of myself as a girl. This is like age 3 to 4. I thought of myself as a girl. I often wanted to dress in girls' clothes. I can remember my parents, my mom, when I was like 5, taking me to the doctor, and the doctor was like, yeah, basically they said, we'll just wait. Like wait. It's kind of like waiting. Just let that boy wait, and then we'll see what happens. And for a long time, I had an inner perception of myself was feminine, I guess I can say. That's the easiest way I can talk about it. Like in my mind's eye, I felt like a girl. But as I started getting older, as I started getting older and I started developing secondary sexual characteristics like body hair, facial hair, etc., it was like, it produced a lot of, I guess what I can say, dysphoria, like pretty intense discomfort with my body. But that was, 12, 13, 14. As I started getting older, it kind of, for me, it diminished. And eventually it kind of resolved. I can remember a particular moment where I had a dream of myself as a girl, I guess, a feminine person. But the next morning I woke up and I had this recollection like, oh, like that's not exactly me. I'm something else. I'm a man, I guess. And this was part of maybe living outside the US in different cultural contexts, etc. But I kind of resolved, I guess I can say. I see my experiences like adjacent to trans people because I did have this experience, but I'm pretty confidently, like I'm cis now, I guess you would say. I feel comfortable being cis. But at the same time, throughout the whole process, I'm same-sex attracted or queer or gay or whatever term you would use. And from some of my reading, there are some queer SSA, etc. people who have my similar experience where they're pretty gender non-conforming.
Mm-hmm.
And then over time, they become cisgender.
Mm-hmm.
I thought people like David Frank, who did not have a similar gender experience, even though he also is gay, queer, SSA, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But how do you think about this, Odessa, in kind of, as you've been thinking about this, how do you think about people who have had this experience where gender nonconformingness, but they never come to a point of maybe transitioning?
Mm-hmm.
They're not detransitioners, but they're just never transitioned. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I
yes.
mean, it definitely happens. And
Mm-hmm.
people, gender dysphoria does resolve. I mean, I've heard that particularly among autistic people, gender dysphoria is extremely common, which may have to do with, like how we relate to embodiment and social cues generally, right? I know that is a great podcast that I'm a member of the, I guess, podcast community, and very much appreciative of Christianity on the Spectrum. And John, who runs that podcast, has done probably 500 interviews with autistic Christians. And, he says it's extremely common. And in most cases, I think about a third of his interviewees were trans ultimately, but the majority of those cases, there was a resolution of gender dysphoria. And that he connects that and he himself experienced gender dysphoria. As he said, it was several years being in the military before he had a sense of like, okay, so I'm beginning to get some sense of the advantage and comfort with male embodiment, right? Was his experience. Even a very much later than you're describing, TJ, sense of like alignment. And that for autistic women, a sense of being a woman, and that the meaningfulness of that comes through pregnancy and childbirth, right? And then that oftentimes autistic women become very, can become very rich about then the biological components of femininity, right? So, I think it's unfortunate because of the way that the conversation has emerged. What's happened is, a generation ago, when you had people who are severely persistently presenting gender dysphoria who transition and it's tremendously beneficial to them, right? You now have people who have this kind of like transient developmental experience of gender dysphoria, and there's not at this point a good way of differentiating those. We don't know
Yes.
prospectively whether the kind that's going to resolve or the kind that's going to be consistent. And I don't know how would you ultimately, because like you can't know ahead of time.
No.
So like there has to be a way of supporting people to like make decisions with incomplete information and hold compassionately the complexities of life, regardless of how they decide to carry their sort of like gendered selves. I would say, particularly if a person, whether or not a person transitions, like I think that it's legitimate to say that's carrying transness in some form. And particularly if a person detransitions, like you can't then get away from it. Your body is always going to be carrying that. But another thing I think we need to confront when asking these questions is like the tendency to, a lot of the pressure to sort of medicalize kids for transition is another form of like cis normativity. Like you're going to have the best if your appearance is gender conforming, and therefore you should start early, right?
Yes.
Whereas to recognize that, like, the ownership of the fact that that we who experience this are fundamentally and irresolvably in some kind of ambiguous middle state of gendered experience, and that's going to be true even if we appear cis, right?
Yeah.
Is an important fact to digest for us personally, and I think is important fact for us to digest socially, that such people exist. Which is where I feel like a lot of trans activism has gone. Like in the local trans activist community here, like half the people I know use it pronouns, right? So there's a sense of like need to bear witness to like indeterminacy or intermediacy, or like not everybody is male or female. Yeah.
Can we talk about youth transition and kind of in the US, how that's the politics of that? This is obviously a pretty prominent political topic. We just touched on it.
Mm-hmm.
I will say from the short autobiographical narrative I just shared, my immediate impulse towards youth transition is pretty negative because I can imagine I am happy that I'm of the age that that wasn't a part of the conversation. I was young. And that doctor that I remember in that meeting said, just wait. Like, we're just going to wait to see what happens with that boy. And I resolved, as I just said, and I think it can be this type of systemic heteronormativity, like just get them solved now so they'll have a better outcome in the future, I guess is the hope. But yeah, I was curious, do you have any other thoughts on that sort of experience and the politics around that in the US right now?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a problem that can be solved politically, right? Particularly, and the attempt to solve it politically and systemically, yeah, it results in, obviously, if there are trans adults, there are trans kids because they were kids at one point, right? That really, I think, orienting ourselves to what does it mean then to what's most compassionate for trans kids, rather than how do we create a world where trans kids don't exist, which ultimately has to do with the erasure of transness as a category. But that, I mean, again, on the kind of like, fruiting body model, like these are questions that we need better tools to answer, and not ones that can be kind of like universally solved by, kind of like legally implementing implementing on ideological bases the way that this needs to be handled medically. I think it's, yeah, I can't really comment on the medical ethics side because these questions are really complex, and like within the development of medical ethics, right? I think we're going to end up with inevitably, people are making the best decisions that they have with the information that they have at the time, and then medicine evolves, and what's common practice at one point in 15 years, you're actually, that was a huge mistake, right?
Yeah, totally.
And so, but like particularly when it comes to questions of gender, there's a danger in like a tide moving away from sort of youth transition is also kind of like incorporating a sense of like judgment about transness and trans people as a whole. And so I don't know how to unwind that. It's kind of scary. So,
yeah, indeed.
I have you interacted at all with Ivan Illich's work, or Ivan Illich, on gender?
I don't think so.
He is a Catholic priest. He wrote this book in 1983, and he takes more of a historical account and looking at kind of the breakdown of modes of, in some ways, when you're talking about like gender reproduction, of the way that men and women are reproducing in themselves as they raise other men and women into this way of being male and female, that system or those modes culturally were destroyed largely in our kind of capitalist industrialist world. That in villages you'd have ways that male and female would participate in the agricultural models, but then as they moved them into the factory, everybody were supposed to be interchangeable parts, and there wasn't the space to operate in gendered modes of being. Anyways, so that's just also spinning around in my head and thinking about these social dynamics and how it's, I think, been argued, kind of coming out of that thinking, that there's a way that because those forms of gender social reproduction have actually been kind of lost or dismantled in different ways, that our whole culture is a little bit gender dysphoric. We're all not really quite sure what these projects of masculinity and femininity are. And
it was a 1983 essay by John Brouillard, the philosopher and psychoanalyst. We are all transsexuals now. Made similar observations, particularly about kind of like the body and politics. As like particularly as we think about the political body, I think there's a dysphoria to our political body that then's drawing attention to. But I think, you know, how prescient in 1983, but like those trends have intensified, and there's a whole additional dimension to it now, that every time you create a social media account, right, or like, you know, a profile in a game, right, like you are transed because you are acknowledging you are implicitly acknowledging a distinction between your embodiment and your gender, right, in selecting male or female or other now, right? And so even if you are cissing, right, like that has become sort of a verb. That's something that you're doing, and there's a recognition built into that practice of the possibility of that being kind of arbitrary, right? And so there's an arbitrariness to it. That arbitrariness, I think, gets propagated through the rest of life, particularly as, you know, then what do we do in social media? Well, we present a particular image of self, right? And that it turns out that the image of self is very malleable, particularly you add in like layer in sort of like AI, you know, photo modification. You realize, oh, look, these kind of small tweaks to my appearance and I appear a completely different gender. Like I can see both the continuity and the change of myself, right? So these are technologies that we're engaging with that change our sense of who we are. But again, like what do you do about that? You can't not have that, right? Like you can't just eliminate those things. Mm-hmm. It affects us on this very intimate level of our sense of who we are, right? Or, you know, in a very sort of like emergent way that was unpredictable and really unstoppable because of where it happens in our self sense, right? I have met people who, you know, will credit their own like the beginning of their trans journey of like having the option of having female avatars in video games, right? Mm-hmm. I bet you'll think this is strange. Like, no, that makes total sense to me that would be the way that would develop for you, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah. We're very sensitive, I think, to the ways in which our sort of virtual embodiments, right, change than our physical embodiments. That in a lot of ways, I think maybe the way that humans are designed, that our virtual embodiments, our soul sense of self is primary, and that our bodily sense of self is secondary. But of course, you know, we can't. Our bodies are not arbitrary, right? There is a givenness that we receive to our bodies. That we're human being is stretched between the givenness of our body and the potentialities of what we can become and what we hope to become. Trans people, I think, draw attention to that, and you know, I guess the whole of reality of modernity is that we discover the potentialities for who we might become are broader than we have traditionally imagined or historically imagined.
Has your thinking through transgender experiences influenced your perception or opinion of transhumanism? I've generally been have a negative reaction to people who want to add cameras into their brains or, you know, connect them in to give them extra senses, or folks who are thinking about, you know, destroying this planet but continuing to transcend humanity across the solar system. And I like living within our limits. I think there's profound depth found when we live into this givenness of our embodiment. So I'm curious if you've seen connections or what your thoughts are.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think that transgender experience and transgender, I guess, body modification is a kind of like entry-level species to transhumanism. Like you're necessarily tugging on all the same strings in kind of like embracing a transgender identity or experience without necessarily even being aware of transhumanism as a philosophical and movement and aspiration, right? I agree with you. I do think that we need to have a sense of the meaningfulness of our limits and of our givenness, and to like our bodies are not, or our givennesses are not irrelevant, right? They are very relevant and they are very real. At the same time, you know, we're not our pilgrimage is not back to the garden, right? It's towards the city.
Yes.
It's towards the kingdom. And so, yeah, again, we live within that as a tension. And there's a certain art of making space for the differences of like where our yearnings direct us. I think there's a tragedy of neglect of limits, but there's also a tragedy of omitting possibilities that were given to us, because we're too concerned with our limits. It's, again, there's an emergent dimension to this where it's like I don't really know. It just sort of happens, and we interpret it as theological data, the way that these things appear within history. And I think that the concerns about it are certainly legitimate. I don't know what to do with them. But like they both exist, and they're both a part of like the landscape and the overall human experience.
It's like these, you mentioned these binaries, like binaries of limits and potential that we just have to engage with and somehow intersect the two different dynamics in different ways in the world.
Yeah.
And we sometimes, those intersections, those dynamics can maybe be unfaithful to God. Sometimes there's just a lot of space to work it out as living a human life. And sometimes maybe there's ways that are notably faithful to God. But it's complex. There's a complex way of engaging the world.
Yeah.
With these particular things. There's lots of them. There's lots of sort of ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I like what we were kind of saying earlier. There's more of a moral accounting that's given for where we end up more than there is a perspective, like I can chart out the way that every Christian should respond to experiences like mine, or, because even if we have some sort of like, kind of like moral framework for how we should regard transhumanism or whatever, you're going to find people who, have far exceeded what we would hold within the domain of morally acceptable.
Yeah.
Who, like find Jesus, right, and then are reflecting on their experience. And so, I know a lot. I'm surprised at how many people that I've met are like trans people that are exploring ministry, who became Christians after they transitioned. I think particularly when it comes to, I don't know, I can't speak for transhumanism more broadly, particularly when there's a sort of like tendency to have almost religious devotion to autonomous human potential, but like the transgender experience, like on the ground level, is profoundly oriented towards spirituality, right? Like there's a sense of personhood that I think orients people towards having a religious narrative towards their life and existence. It's, and to the extent that people end up being hostile to Christianity, it's mostly because they've experienced the church as hostile to them first, right? And the number of trans Christians that there are, in spite of that, right? Like with full consciousness of that is always quite beautiful and surprising to me.
Yeah. I often see this with sexuality too. In a lot of my comparative work of studying gender and sexuality, gender nonconformity and queer sexuality often come together, right? And I have a hypothesis that I need to get more data on, but I think a lot of these people for whom this intersection happens between sexuality and gender nonconformity, they're often like shaman or spiritual leaders or something like that. And again, I need more data to actually make this case in a stronger way, but I'm seeing this resonance. And this is kind of tying to what you just said and what my experience of being around queer people, like same-sex attracted, gay, etc. people, is that they also often have this spiritual sensitivity, this openness to the meaning found through religious theological narratives. Yeah. So there's something there, but it needs, I think, it could make a more robust articulation than we have right now, basically, if we want to.
Yeah, I mean, I relate queerness to the orientation or the kind of like the flow of the generative energies of the soul, right? So generative aspect, generative energies, right? And so that that flows in terms of gender expression, sexual orientation, but also creativity and sort of aesthetic, right? And that tends to fall outside of norms of kind of like, I don't know, it falls outside of norms.
Yeah, it does.
Whatever seems normal, like it tends to be on the fringes of that.
Yeah. It's also part of this conversation of inside B, probably from Eve Tushnet, who's a Catholic thinker, who's, is considered side B. She talks about how sometimes we have to kind of transfigure our desires or our energy. This sort of, she doesn't exactly say those words, but she's in that line of thinking for different modes of engaging and being generative. Like you said, creativity. It could be caring for the poor. It could be liturgical writing. It could be intellectual writing. It could be lots of things. But is it kind of this movement of this generative nature of the soul that you're touching on? And seeing what is the possibility if queer, non-gender conforming people have this energy that they're redirecting towards other things than the generative potentialities of a human being, where can it go? Or what do you do with it?
Right.
And I think that's part of the answer in Christian terms of how to think through these things.
Yeah. And well, this is where I see, trans women contributing to like the understanding of what it is to be a woman, right? There's a sort of like very deliberate, because it's been deconstructed and reconstructed, right? What it is to like appear feminine or to be a woman, right? Which many trans women end up like actually reading much more feminine than actual women. There's a sort of like hyper reality to trans women, which, I mean, as a question of representation or like coherence with truth, right? There's a moral question there, but in terms of what's learned in the process of deconstruction and reconstruction, there's fascinating data to be gathered, right? Which is why I find it to be like the trans voice is a really exciting frontier in our like respective male and female, masculine, feminine understandings of what it even is to be that gender. And we learn a lot from dialogue with trans people, cis people and trans people dialoguing regarding their respective gendered categories that we lose when we try to limit or eliminate that voice.
Can we talk more about this question of, we've been touching, do you think the spirituality or spiritual experience of gender minorities and or trans people is different than cis people? I think so far we might say yes in some ways, but yeah, what do you think about that?
Oh man, that's an interesting question. I mean, not being cis, even when I was cis presenting, right? Like, then there was like that dimension to my experience, or that dimension to my experience of myself. Like, I don't have any way of answering that question, right? I think that there necessarily must be, because there is in I guess the queer experience a sort of like, but the queer experience by definition involves taking the normative material and having a sense of alienation from it that then one brings into dialogue with the normative material, right? And so, if it's sort of if it just kind of whatever you're given just sort of works for you, you don't have to do that work in the same way, right? And I mean, I would hesitate to say that, that must have its own kind of interiority to it. But like, I can't imagine that interiority without at least from the perspective of wrestling deeply with those questions. What would it be like for that to just make sense and be easy? Like, I don't know. So.
Yeah. Another question. We touched on this our previous recording and a little bit at the beginning of this episode. But how do you think the gospel and the kingdom of God relates to gender regimes and gender hierarchies? And what does this mean for you? And yeah, there's definitely different perspectives on this question. And I'm curious how you're processing this particular question.
Yeah, I mean, I find, when Paul says that in Christ there's neither male nor female. To me, that signals to me fundamentally that, you know, the gospel, the kingdom is aimed against any sort of like hierarchicalization of gendered experience. At the same time, you know, like Paul gives in giving sort of like ethical templates for the first Christian communities, there's a recognition of gender differentiation. So there's a kind of like accommodation to, that's the direction accommodation goes. There's an accommodation to sort of like the traditional or kind of like the normative experience that to me is always sort of provisional. Like I tend to see Paul's that this is a provisional. It's not the full vision of the kingdom that what Paul articulates, but it is like making space for the reality that people have, you know, gendered expectations and gendered experiences that sort them in a particular way. There's a desire within that differentiation that exists because of, you know, the structures that we live within to de-hierarchicalize and highlight the equality of all people in Christ, and to change the sort of like disorganized, conflict-ridden experience of the human person and lift that up into the harmony of the body. And so there's the transfiguration, I would say, of gendered experience from one of being hierarchical to one of being harmonious and sort of like mutually informing that we are continually in our relationships with one another as male and female, cis and trans, right, gay and straight, like learning from one another in the varieties of our experience, that we're invited into a economy of curiosity regarding the differentiations of our experience, rather than a sort of like rather than being governed by the law, which institutes kind of like normative structures that all must abide by, right? That's kind of the way that I would look at that. Unfortunately, what's happened, particularly in, you know, from Constantine onward, is a sort of the level of accommodation to hierarchical gendered structures gets to the point where like the church becomes the enforcer of kind of like a inherited norm, rather than the transfigurer, kind of like the liberatory force of those who do not fit within it, which is where I think early Christianity is as operating.
Interesting. So it's not there's neither male nor female. It's not a rejection of the existence of gender, saying all Christians should be non-binary per se, but it is neither a reinforcement of the gender norms as well as a rejection of specific hierarchies between the genders. And it's just a hard, I think it's just a hard needle to thread of, yeah, like committing to, even at an accommodation level, like the reality of gender expressions, gendered norms, or like, I don't even know a better language, but like the norms within society, but without them being forcibly normative.
Yeah.
And
well, I mean, that's tactically the way that I've been handling things now. I mean, within a lot of churches, there's a sense of like, well, how do we extend hospitality, you know, like our pronoun hospitality? It's like, well, I'm going to give you ideological hospitality, right? Like, I understand that, you know, kind of like my, you know, gender expression and identity are things that make you uncomfortable. And like, I still want to be in a relationship with you. And like, I'm extending that hospitality, putting kind of like, instead of the normative expectations being in the center, the sort of like marginal experience being in the center. Like, I can do that because I come from, historically in my own life formation, a position of privilege. So I could carry that sort of like that memory of being centered, right, into a marginal experience in a way that like actually, you know, when I was sufficiently, you know, conforming, well, I you know, I've always been pegged as, you know, queer, but insofar as like I was building community, even along the margins, it was exercising that what I was kind of implicitly given for the sake of like making more space for misfits and marginal people. And that's something that, I carry that same sensibility into like, okay, how do I leverage the particularities of my own embodiment and experience in a way that makes space for experiences that are different than mine. And within that, there's also space for people whose experiences are mainstream, right? And a recognition, like a pastoral recognition of the fact that like, yeah, a lot of this is really disturbing to people who have assumptions about reality that does not accommodate for experiences like mine or perspectives like mine. I hope that's sustainable.
I struggle a bit with the vision that you're casting, just because I also tend to see that, like, for example, Paul in the household codes,
Mm-hmm.
he was being liberatory with some of his gendered advice too. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe it is accommodationite, maybe, but also there's a liberatory movement. Like husband, love your wives is better than the alternatives of how men might have related to their wives, for example. And it's actually good. I would say it's a positive good. Like loving your wife is positive good. Though the flip side, women respect your husbands, at least in the English translation, is maybe that's not quite an equal thing if that's what we desire.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, but I'm trying to think through this particular aspect of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
I can definitely see it has you, and I think even me, we're very interested in the eschatological vision and what that means for the ethical life of a Christian disciple.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm still trying to integrate how you relate the resurrection, but also the resurrection is resurrection from the creation.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a resurrected body of the creation, which is also an eschatological body, so it's not quite the same. But there's these tensions that I'm trying to put these theological dynamics in play with thinking about what Paul's doing with like in God there's no male or female, barbarian or Greek, etc., etc. So it's complicated.
It is. I know. I had
a
couple of weeks ago. I had the opportunity. I was up at Holden Village and heard some, class given by a couple of women theologians from the ELCA on their 2019 statement on faith, sexism, and justice. And they had recently written a book about it and explaining the ELCA teaching, which is quite radical, And it begins instead of in discussing gender. Instead of beginning from Genesis, it begins from the new creation. And their orientation, the eschatological dimension is actually quite muted, which was really interesting for me to dialogue with them on. They pick up on, I forget the theologian, Pannenberg, I think, of this kind of like paranesis, right? And the kingdom is sort of like bubbling up from within. So the emphasis is on dignity and justice. And so it ends up being like, in that respect, it does not center, the prophetic eschatological dimension of trans experience, which is where I want to go, right? Yeah. It centers, the kingdom as a place of like universal human dignity and justice, and extends logic from that perspective that is intended to be persuasive to, like the roomful of grandmas. The room full of like white grandmas, and I appreciate that because like I recognize like everything about me, like from it reads as very radical, even as much as it's like deeply traditional, right? It is very disruptive, right? And that traces down into my embodiment as well. And like that is not, like many people are not ready for that. So there's a need to marry that sort of like eschatological orientation to something like this vision that's rooted more in paranesis and rooted in questions of justice and how does the church make space for its prophets rather than kill them? And like within that is also like the sense of reception of the norm of what is historically the case, of what is kind of like the ancient law, right? And has that sense of being so ingrained into the human person as to be transcendent, which, although of course we know, particularly around gender, that that gender norms are very variable across culture and
Mhm.
history, they have this feeling of being immutable and cosmic, right?
Yeah.
And like that feeling is something that is worth honoring, even as it doesn't accommodate the beautiful diversity that is, the full scope of human expression, much less integrated as it will be in ways that we can't like fully anticipate in the kind of eschatological kingdom.
As you think about eschatological resurrection and so much of this gender being related to the generative capacities, and as I understand Jesus' teaching of that, he doesn't say there will no longer be, well, Paul says there's no male and female. Jesus says there will not be, marriage in the age to come. And I tie that with an end of biological reproduction. How do these things go into your thinking around resurrection and gender in the age to come? Of will there still be a resurrected biology that is sexed, even though there's no sex?
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that like when I say like the soul it has a capacity for gender rather than being gendered, right? The generic soul. Our particularized souls are shaped by our experience of embodiment, right? And so like for me to be me at the resurrection involves my moving through gendered experience, which I don't know how you erase. How do you incorporate gendered experience into a sort of resurrected person? Is then no longer has a sort of need for biological reproduction. Therefore, the biological basis for the sexed body no longer exists. But then the soul impression that the sexed body has left on the individual does persist and is incorporated into the resurrected person in some way, right? That's kind of how I would look at it. I think that whereas the soul receives like the seed of its gendered experience from the body, the resurrected body receives its kind of like orientation towards sexedness from the soul. Like I guess that'd be my best guess. It's a very analogous question to, like that we ask when it comes to like persons with disabilities, right? And like, how is that disability incorporated into the resurrected body when it's so much a part of their earthly experience? This is acknowledged as like a imperfection or bodily limitation that is healed relative to a normal body, and yet is so much a part of a person's identity that they can't really imagine themselves without it, and it seems like kind of a violation that a normative body would be imposed upon them as an aspect of the resurrected experience, right? So I don't know. I think that it has to be accounted for in a sort of resurrected embodiment, but how it will be accounted for is beyond my pay grade.
Yeah, I mean, and I feel like that does show respect to the way that Paul talks about the mystery of the resurrection in, I believe, Romans 15. This, like, there is this continuity, but it's like a seed and a plant. Yep. It's a real continuity. That plant comes from the seed, but like you can't quite look at a mustard seed and imagine the mustard plant. Yep. And yeah, and so I appreciate your imagining around this kind of unseverable connection between the soul and the body, and as well as into the resurrection, but with some mystery there. Yeah,
and we do not know what we shall be, but we shall be like him, for we will see him like he is, right? That's another good picture of that.
Yeah, who is the Lamb who was resurrected, so it's this healed body, free of death, yet with scars.
Yep.
These tiebacks to what has happened.
Yeah. Well, I will say also as a, like historically, there's been a lot of speculation on this, right? You know, there's some traditions that say, you know, we will all be resurrected as, you know, 33-year-old male, because that's obviously, you know, the archetype for humanity, right? I think that persists in some like Coptic iconography, or, you know, like evidently Origenists had some kind of picture of souls as spherical, right? You know, and so like the resurrected body ends up spherical. You know, one of my professors at Marquette had an Origenist Barbie doll with a pink tennis ball with like eyes, you know.
That's funny. I didn't say, for any listeners, this also comes up in thinking about same-sex orientation or queerness in that regard. Like the same question is being asked in the resurrection body as we're talking about with gender nonconformity or transgender experience, as well as disability. So they're all part of this mysterious way of thinking through where humans come from and where they're maybe intended to go, like in an eschatological sense. So, yeah.
Odessa, to wrap us up, could you share us, maybe we've touched on it, but how do you currently understand holiness in regard to the trans experience? And maybe especially as that relates to love in light of the trans experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think that ultimately the way of holiness is like the way of the cross, right? And that we, regardless of how one embodies one's trans experience, there's a way in which that is self-giving and self-emptying rather than self-creating or self-projecting. And to recognize that like transition is a cross and not transition is also a cross, right? There is no escaping the cross. And so for me, the distinction between like a holy versus an unholy way to be trans is not transitioning or not, but in terms of the framework by which we interpret what we are doing, right? Is it self-assertion or like a self-creation project, or is it self-emptying of kind of like taking on of the social stigma, like the directionality of one's interpretive relationship to one's trans experience for the holy individual is wrapped up in the bigger scriptural story, in the bigger story of our redemption, whereas, you know, a non-holy, I would say necessarily unholy, ends up being motivated by other kinds of pictures and I think that, you know, this is just a human experience generally, like our experiences always have the potentiality of being reoriented or re-understood through the lens of what God has done in Christ. And that's what sets it apart for the work of being then an instrument of God's work in Christ through us for the reconciliation of all things to himself. When it comes to like the specific exercise of love, that's a very open question. Like there's so much that, you know, like trans experiences completely unsettles my intuitive sense of ethical frameworks around the understanding of the way that sexuality should normatively be exercised. So, you know, I've actually gone back to the beginning recently. You know, I have a person with whom I have some romantic engagements or like affections, and, you know, we're separated by distance. So it's sort of a non-question in that angle, but like we're studying Plato together. And yeah, I know, right? There's nothing more romantic. You make you want to read Plato again, you know, like this is great. And so like, yeah, I mean, there's this interesting tension between, I think particularly evident within Plato, of like eros as being revelatory and eros being destructive, right? That essential dialectic is visible even before you get to questions of like, oh, then what is holiness, and what role does kind of self-control play within the unfolding of holiness? And to me, you know, like that's actually kind of a bad question, because, you know, if you, and this has been my experience historically, that when so many eggs are put in the basket of self-control, you know, it becomes just another self-creation project rather than a kind of creating space for the spirit to work within the human person. And for me, so much of my own experience of like, I guess sanctification has been allowing my attempts at self-control to be thwarted by the Spirit working in my life, right? And this, powerful sense, we say, we love because God first loved us. But when I was working so hard to control myself regarding my feelings of chaos and shame and uncertainty regarding my interior experience of gender and embodiment, I experienced God's love as control and attempted to live that out by controlling other people, albeit in a very gentle way of just like, I'm going to set the parameters, as a priest of like what is normative and be concerned about those who are outside of it and try to get everybody into line. Whereas now having come to a point where that sort of fell apart and feeling God's love as this sort of tender affection that meets me in my uncertainty and meets me in my brokenness, like my heart is expanded to the strangeness and the diversity of human experience and all the messes that we get into, right? Like, and that to me, there's a sense of connection to the holy in that sort of like deep positive regard, where sin becomes in Julian's words, behovely, right? Like it's part of what this whole kind of ecosystem that is of human experience and creation that is loved by God and drawn into his redemption. That is a sort of deeper holiness than I ever kind of experienced or could even imagine when holiness was about like monitoring the boundaries between what is morally acceptable and not. So that's how I'm thinking about it these days. Yeah.
Thank you. I was muted. No, I really appreciate those reflections that move holiness beyond moral boundary keeping. I think that's too often where we think about sanctification rather than this being set apart for God's unique and surprising purposes.
Being wrapped up in a gospel aesthetic. Yeah.
Yeah, and they don't. That shouldn't turn into moral relativism, right. But it is messier than maintaining, especially man's codes of conduct. Sure. Yeah, thank you so much for this time. We are continuing to want to just listen to thoughtful voices, particularly trans voices, trans experiences and theologies of gender. And just gives me a lot to chew on. Yeah. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure.
I am so thankful, Odessa. Thank you so much for coming to share your thoughts. I think for me, they were very, very helpful just to think through some of the common topics, understand more of the kind of trajectories that we might think through, and some of the dynamics that we're trying to engage in that are similar, both among kind of queer, gay, SSA people, but also gender nonconforming, trans, gender minority people.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you both. This is delightful.
Bye, Odessa.
Take care. Yeah, be well.
This podcast is fully supported by people like you who want to see it continue. If you like this podcast, first, please consider sharing it with a friend who might also like it. Referrals from others are the biggest way people find our podcast. And second, please consider supporting this podcast on Substack. Starting at $5 a month, you can ensure this podcast continues, and you'll also get access to our subscribers-only WhatsApp group for new kinship supporters. We'd love to hear from you as we continue to pursue diverse perspectives and nuanced conversations around sexuality, ethnicity, desire, and belonging in the kingdom of Christ.